Hey everybody, I'm Ryo Yamaguchi, the publicist at Copper Canyon Press, and you are watching season 2 of our interview series, Line Break, which goes off the page and into the homes and minds of our beloved poets. We began Line Break as a way to connect during the severe lockdowns of the pandemic, and we've had so much fun seeing poets on screen, hearing poems, talking about writing, books, and life, that we simply had to keep the series going. So thanks for tuning in. I have been pretty eager for today's interview for quite a while. I have learned so much from Christopher Soto about the abolitionist movement and how poetry can help make the world better for all of us. Today gives us a chance to really lay it all out. So I want to welcome you, Christopher. Thanks for being here. How's your morning going?
Pretty good. Always love chatting with you and have my little coffee here. So I'm ready to get into the weeds of it.
Yeah, let's get into the weeds. So we have this tradition on the show of having poets introduce themselves, and I kind of want to keep with that if you're good with that. So I was hoping you could say your name again, any pronouns you want to identify, where you live, the most recent book you published for sure, anything else.
Yeah, Christopher Soto, he, they pronouns. I live in Southern California, Los Angeles County. And this is my baby, the debut book, Diaries of a Terrorist with Copper Canyon. Aw, twins.
So happy to have it, and it just published, and enjoying things like that awesome LA Times profile that got into so much, and that kind of helped inform a little bit of this conversation here. We'd love seeing that, and looking forward to more and more, audience for the book for these wonderful poems. One thing that I kind of like to get kind of going on too, which is another tradition we have of a question here at Line Break, is hoping that you can kind of like go back in time a little bit to when you were a young person, when you first started engaging the arts, and tell us about a moment when you first saw yourself in a book, in a song, in a movie, the first time you recognized yourself in the space of art.
I've been writing poetry since first grade. I remember my teacher would give us rock candy when we would write in cursive. So I'd be
that's so amazing. I'll never forget that, rock candy and cursive. That's like such a good pairing. Like, yeah.
So I remember it was actually like, I'm in my 30s now, but I still remember in first grade where I missed one of the loops on and when I was trying to do an M in cursive. And so I didn't get that was the only word I spelled wrong because I was being pompous and trying to do cursive while everyone else was doing like the regular handwriting. But so that teacher was actually really informative because she encouraged us to do cursive. She encouraged us to write poems. My first poem was I like Miss Vice, and she earned, Miss Vice is nice and she likes rice. And I didn't know if she did or not, but I was a first grader and really flexing monosyllabic end rhyme. So I guess off the bat, my natural inclination was towards musicality in written text. But by the time that I got into high school, I was leading a spoken word poetry club at my high school that I was part of, and I joined the Inland Empire Slam team. The Inland Empire is just east of Los Angeles. And I also had my first publication because there was an English teacher that I had in high school who was really supportive of the spoken word poetry club and my writing. And she sent like a contest to me. And she's like, this is for high schoolers who are seeking to get published. And so that was my first time being accepted for publication in a book. And then by the time that I went to college, I started kind of talking to writers a bit more, a bit more regionally. I mean, throughout the West Coast in California, because even in high school, I was reaching out to writers throughout all of LA County in Southern California. And then by the time that I was in graduate school, I really started to understand kind of the national publishing landscape. And now I feel like postgraduate school and in my first book, I'm starting to think more transnationally about literature. So it's been kind of nice to over the scale of my over the time in my life continue to see the same obsession, but just different components or different camps and schools of poetry come into my view.
Yeah, that's such a cool way of describing. Like, I love hearing this expansive kind of thing, you know, where like you start like in a classroom or in a club, and it's just getting, you know, larger and larger until you're in the entire world, you know. I also love a good story about teachers, you know, and I think of my favorite English, you know, Miss Morrison, Mr. Saldana. I mean, these were, you know, reading, you know, T.S. Eliot or whatever for the first time and things like that. So amazing. Was it a teacher that introduced you to spoken word, or had you been to spoken word events like around town, or yeah?
Yeah, so Southern California and LA in particular has a huge spoken word history. A Mic in Dim Lights in Pomona is one of the biggest like open mic spoken word venues in the country. I don't know if it's still running or not, but at the time it was. And then same thing with DPL, the Poetry Lounge in Los Angeles, that also had a huge following. And so I grew up with just a lot of, you know, spoken word poets and writers, you know, around and accessible. And I don't remember how I necessarily got into that scene. I remember at the same time, though, HBO's Deaf Poetry was being televised. And I remember like being this little baby writer and just being like, I want to feature on one of these open mics. Like, I want to be invited as a feature, or being like, I want to be on HBO's Deaf Poetry Jam. And it's a bit egotistical, like now retrospectively, but it was like, it felt so exciting for me as a young writer to be like, oh, there's places where you can go and speak in community, you could build and, you know, um, and opportunities for writers out there. So that's always been my, I guess, part of my understanding of the literary arts as far back as I can go. It's always been like there's community and there's writers and there's more that you could do within the arts. I never felt like limited.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's really cool to find spaces that, you know, provide examples for what's possible, like particularly in poetry and with spoken word. I mean, I think that's especially true because it's so public and it's speaking truth in these ways that are very interactive, you know, with the audience, of course. Like, and I was also a really big fan of deaf poetry and deaf comedy jam. And I remember like, I mean, I was like watching that when I was like 9 or 10 and learning like kind of, and then learning like how like comedy, like stand up and poetry are like super similar to each other, like in the ways that you're trying to reconfigure reality and, you know.
And I remember Saul Williams on HBO's Deaf Poetry Jam was so set on HBO Deaf Poetry Jam was so influential to me at that time in my life. And I just loved Saul Williams when I was in high school and still now. And I think it was in the Facebook days that he had like reposted one of my early publications or poems. And I was like, I was like, Saul Williams saw my work. And I was like nerding out. And I think that's one of the really cute things about like being a writer is that like you just always, those moments feel so precious to me. Like when someone whose work you respect like sees your work and like also likes it, or you know when you meet a writer for the first time. This is one of my favorite literary traditions of like when you bring your book and then they like reach into their tote bag and they also have a book and your writers exchange like their books at lunch. There's just so many like beautiful parts to like literary nerd interactions that I find really endearing.
Yeah, that's so cool. I mean, and here I'm kind of hearing you, you know, reply to that question of you seeing yourself recognized in Saul Williams or like in that interaction, like, you know, which is so cool. Were
Yeah.
there other things? Were you ever into like zine culture or anything like that? Or yeah, yeah.
Oh yeah. It's my first zine is somewhere over there in the bookshelves. Um, but the first poetry zine I did was called How to Eat Glass, and it was produced by Still Life Press, which is just kind of the name that was given to like the series of zines. And it was a lot of like predominantly Latino, like punk skaters, visual artists in the Inland Empire who were working on that zine. The main person who was doing it was Daniel Aaron Flores. And I remember we would just like, print the zines at home and sit on the floor and staple them and pass them out at like readings and art shows. And on the cover of this particular poetry zine that I created with them is artwork by Mario Ayala, who is another Latino artist based in Southern California. And we went to junior high school together. And now Mario is having his first solo exhibition in New York City at the Deich Gallery in fall.
Oh, cool.
And so we ran into each other at a party in LA a month or two ago. And he was just like, we made it out. And I was like, and we're still artists. And we just like hugged each other and we're just like, it just felt like, it still feels, I think about that all the time. It just feels so mind-boggling that he made it out, I made it out. He has his gallery, his first solo show coming up in New York City at the same time that I have my book coming up. And I see that like early zine where his cover art, we were young kids and his cover art is on the front of the zine. And now people want to look at Chicano Latino art in Los Angeles, but it's wild that we were producing work together as kids and that we're still here. We need to write an article about it sometime. Or so, can someone write an article about it?
No, for sure. Yeah. We'll make it part of the publicity push. That's such a beautiful story. I love that. That reconnection, because then you've also like, then there's this whole thing of your two parallel or, coterminous paths, like, and I don't know. I've never really had an experience like that. I think it's just really beautiful. Yeah.
It is.
How so like how did you, when you got to like the MFA, like how did you feel? Did you feel that there was continuity with like all of your early creative modes and output, like, or did you feel like the MFA, came into contrast with that? Or what was your experience like, I guess, maturing, quote unquote, like through the program?
It was pretty odd, because I had access to like spoken word poetry and histories of oration within the literary arts. But when I looked at Southern California's literary scene on the page, we were always taught, outside of school, writers like Buccieri, who in the Mead School of Poetry, who were very masculine. And I remember seeing videos of like Buccieri kicking his like girlfriend or partner, like on the videos are probably still up on YouTube. And I was like, this isn't the lineage that I want. Like and I feel like other writers, like, I never got to meet Wanda Coleman. I didn't know about Wanda until later. And I got to meet and follow Tatiana de la Tierra. But during their lifetimes as, writers in Los Angeles, I don't know how much the national literary landscape really paid attention to them. And I went to undergrad school over here at Cal State Long Beach. And I didn't feel plugged into like the national publishing landscape in terms of like page poetry. And so grad school was a bit of a shock for me because I went to NYU. So I was leaving Southern California for the first time. And there are Central Americans in New York in the way that there is in LA. The community is still there. It just looks a bit different. And obviously there's seasons. Like I remember I would feel like the cold inside of my bones. Like it wasn't like put on another layer. It was like my body was a body that has never experienced anything below 60 degrees. And I would feel like the inside of my spirit just shaking. So there was like cultural changes when I had to move to New York. But I remember when I first went to grad school at NYU, part of me there was a lot going on. Part of me was upset about the disparities between what I saw at Cal State Long Beach and what I saw at NYU. Like at Cal State Long Beach, I was one in who knows how many students that was like fighting and begging and looking for resources and couldn't access it. And at NYU, they were so responsive, and I felt like I had everything I wanted within 5 minutes. I mean, might have just, everyone's experience is different, but I felt like I was really catered to and well treated at that university. And I looked at my peers, and I remember one of the first questions that I had, one of my professors was like a former US poet laureate, the first class I had at NYU. And he said, all right, can you say your names and where you went to undergrad? And I was sitting at this little townhouse bought out by essentially like a multimillionaire family for my writer's program. And the middle of Greenwich Village with the poet laureate. And everyone around me says, Yale, Penn, Columbia, Oxford, and everyone has these esteemed undergrad degrees. And I'm there and I'm like, Cal State Long Beach. And I remember that a lot of them also had publications prior to entering the graduate program. So that first year at NYU, and some of them, because they had access earlier on, had also received scholarships that were like merit-based, but I couldn't access because I didn't have that merit. But I didn't have that merit because I didn't know how to publish or have access to mentorship, et cetera. So I was really upset about things like that, in the ways that those types of privileges kind of reproduce themselves. And I remember I would come into the writer's house early, I would leave late. In the middle of classes, people would have restroom breaks. And when they were reading restrooms, I was pulling theses from the bookshelves of people who graduated to see who came out of the program and what they were working on. They had like all these literary journals throughout the writer's house. And I didn't know the reputations of the different literary journals. And so I just started like pulling and reading the different literary journals and magazines and figuring out like who was publishing where, like what, eventually I found out like what the distribution for the different magazines looked like. But all of this was like, I was obsessive that first year. And I felt like I was trying to catch up to my peers and understanding who the journals were, how do you publish in these journals, what does the whole industry mean. So I definitely feel like in terms of the written word, in publishing in more of these, in some of these spaces that are more affiliated with academia or major media sites, that didn't happen until grad school.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I mean, I'm hearing like so many different elements of this. I mean, one is like, I mean, you representing, Southern California and representing the community that you come from, there sitting in this, in this group at a cafe, and also crashing into the poetry business and crashing into these forms of entitlement. And I love also any story about someone who realizes what's in front of them and needs to, and begins this labor, right? I mean, all of this work, pulling down the theses, looking at what the publishing business is like, and learning how you're going to navigate it. It's inspiring. It's inspiring to hear that, well, maybe this is a good time for a poem. Like, you feel like reading a poem from the new book?
Yeah, we could do that. Yeah. I want to read a poem that is 27. That is not particularly made for oration. So I think maybe that's kind of nice that we've talked a little bit about my relationship to literary histories of oration and also publishing within more academic circles. And I think sometimes folks who land in page poetry and American publishing that's lauded by more academic spaces view it as like the only poetry school or camp or whatever. And I'm like, no, like spoken word and oral histories in the United States are so deep and have their own lineages and have their own like meters for what constitutes as like good, or their own metrics for what constitutes as like quote good poetry, or what skill or what craft looks like in relationship to spoken word poetry, for example. And there are whole economies and communities and a whole life related to spoken word and oral poetries.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes page poets think that they're the only ones or craft or school that exist, and is not true. So it's interesting kind of going between those two worlds. But I say that because this poem fails in terms of its ability to be delivered via mouth. So if you're thinking about what a spoken word may be considering, poet may be considering while writing craft, you're thinking about the usage of repetition, how you can get the listener to walk away with the overall message of the poem, or you're thinking about like the fluctuations in your voice and how the fluctuations in your voice and the movements of your face and your body reflect the content of your poem, so that the listener or the viewer can have the most like intimate relationship to the content that you're saying. And so these are all kind of things that you're thinking about as you're writing, you're crafting the poem. My bodily and my tonal inflections and the audience's memories are not considerations that I have while I approach a poem to write on the page for a place like Copper Canyon, because the method of delivery is just different. So the craft is different. So I wanted to say that kind of just as an ode to various camps and schools of poetry, and also to say that this poem functions better on the page and within the craft of spoken word. Sorry. This poem's called Orgies for the Elderly. Swayed by the world's ugliest models, and finally enjoying the mediocrity of ourselves. We sold art for aristocracy, and some days we were so desperate for touch, breastfeeding mothers made us jealous. Should be more ashamed, we know. We looked our anus in the ugly, and it was looking back at us. How we shifted from desire to desire until there was no more wanting. Ghastly scared of being stuck like a blowfish in plastic rings. Do you know how to scare an octopus? Ask about its future. Memory swam by, a silver shark we didn't want to touch. We took out the trash. We took out ourselves. We got arthritis while jerking him off, and our dentures dropped onto his pubes. We drooled like a little dog. We came with our walker in a mountain of Viagra, then sucked until the slow celestial release. While Zapatistas sang their hymnos in Chiapas, we got life advice from pregnant teens. Only salt for sugar daddies. Thursdays we knelt like a horse braiding its hair in the cypress tree. Horses are unicorns that lost the war. Always next up in the poverty line. We watched our culture sell on the stock exchange, becoming recycled TV memories. Each cloud dreamt of solid form. To forever love gay collage boys. To forever pray beneath the Pope's glitter thong.
That's great. I really love that poem, and I'm thinking of so many things that you mentioned in your introduction to that, and thinking about spoken poetry and page poetry, and also, just as we could hear in that poem, all of these different dimensions of myth and lyricism and things. But the thing I kind of want to talk about is sex, and all the kink poems. Like,
always.
That's all I want to talk about.
Always a good topic.
No, I mean, so the kink poem, I would call them like the kink. Okay, so like, the book is obviously, it's abolitionist work. It's an activist poetry. It demands truth and accounting for police violence, these serious themes. But then I think there's this counterbalancing theme that runs through the book too, which is love, sex, the amorousness, the kink. And some of my favorite poems are the sex poems, the kink poems in the book. So I'm kind of curious, like, what makes a good sex poem? And also, like, how did you think about them in this book?
Yeah, I think for me, there's a strong history of queers pushing against police violence. And so to have these really freaky, kinky, queer sex poems in the middle of a book about abolishing the police felt very natural to me. So I'm thinking about the fact that in 1966, there was the Compton cafeteria riots in San Francisco's Tenderloin district, pushing against police brutality and the harassment of queer and trans communities by the police. In 1967, in Los Angeles at the Black Cat, there was also protest in response to police harassment of queer and trans communities. And then I believe it's 1969, a few years later, was Stonewall. So California led the way in some of these anti-cop queer protests. And then you had Stonewall, I believe, in 69. That's also noted for pushing queer and trans communities, pushing back against police brutality and harassment. I think one of the things that is happening right now is that we're positioning police harassment of, I'll be more specific in the weird. Some people are positioning police harassment of queer communities in the past tense as if it does not continue to exist today. But we know that in 2017, Jesse Hernandez was killed by Denver police. We saw the incarceration of C.C. McDonald for a Black trans woman for defending herself. We saw the harassment of police against Chelsea Manning. We know that Patrisse Cullors is leading the Black Lives Matter, is one of the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, speaking against police brutality. So we know that right now, police continue to harass, to detain, to kill queer and trans communities. And I think this kind of narration as policing only affected queer communities when there were masquerade laws or when they were crashing queer bars is false and racist. So for me, having all these queer poems in the middle of an abolitionist book felt very natural. In terms of like understanding them as like sex poems, I don't necessarily go, okay, I'm gonna write some really hot shit. Like this is gonna be, for me, I think about my relationship to punk. And, there's a whole history of Latino punks in LA. And I'm even thinking about this organization called GLUE, Gay and Lesbian Latinos Unidos, which were queer Latino activists in LA. And I just saw a documentary about them last week. And they were talking, and these are activists from like the 1980s, and they were talking about their relationship to punk. And, and so one of the components of punk for me is its adoration of, political dissonance, sacrilegion, and also sexual perverseness. And so when I write some of these poems like Orgies for the Elderly, like I don't think Orgies for the Elderly is a particularly hot title or like hot like scene, but I think about it more in relationship to like my adoration for a punk literary aesthetic and my acknowledgement of like queer anti-carceral histories.
Yeah, amazing. That's so, man, I love hearing you highlight one thing. I love hearing you highlight the centrality of the queer community, like in all kinds of activist circles. And of course, I think that's something that's part of what we would just, I think what I hear you describing is what we maybe call intersectionality now, with all kinds of different communities or different identifier groups that are coming together, in hopes of justice or to fight, for justice. Like, but I'm in regards to that, like, one other element of this book that I think is really important, and it's certainly been part of like the way that we've sort of talked about it when we talk to media, is this use of the pronoun we, and this idea of a poet speaking, for community on behalf of a community. And that's so strong and powerful here, in this work and in the interlocutors that the speaker interacts with. I'm kind of curious if you could talk about the dynamic of speaking in this in this larger we voice, but also speaking out of your own personal lived experience. I mean, there's so many stories in this book that certainly are your stories, you know, and I'm curious like how you thought through those two different forms of subjectivity, you know?
Yes, I changed the book to the we pronoun, or the manuscript to the we pronoun from the I pronoun, a bit later in really, it took 8 years to write this book. So I think it was maybe around like year 7 or so that I was like, let me look at the pronoun choice within this book. I was doing a whole bunch of different types of reading of the book. I was looking at like the tense, I was looking at it through like queer, trans, feminist, abolitionist lenses, and I was just doing different readings and interpretations of the text and seeing how I could really. So one of the readings that I did was looking at pronouns. I did another reading looking at punctuation, another reading looking at capitalization. Like, if there is one thing in this book that is like out of place, I will be so shocked. But I got to the point where even like John and I from Copper Canyon Press, like we're debating the place of a period on the back cover of my biography in the book, because I was like, John, I have spent so much time being so meticulous about every aspect. Because I'm like, you don't need a period. I was like, give me that period. But back to your question, the we pronoun feels like the closest approximation to what I wanted to accomplish politically within the book. I think that the we pronoun allows me to kind of push back against American individualism and say that movements are made out of individuals, movements are made out of whole communities, out of collectives. And sometimes these communities and collectives that form movements, oftentimes, whether you're looking at the civil rights movement in the United States, if you're looking at coalitions and movements that were made during the Salvadorian Civil War, there's different peoples with different ideologies. Even within the abolitionist movement, there's some people who want abolition now, such as myself, and some people who want, quote, incremental abolitionism, which is like, we'll slowly get there. And I don't believe in incremental abolitionism. I think that's another name for reform. So the we pronoun for me felt like a push against American isolationism, allowing myself to decentralize this notion that movements happen via one solitary figure, MLK, Cesar Chavez. That's not how a movement doesn't happen with one person. And I wanted to have this book read within the context of other abolitionist thinkers, writers, artists, and also survivors. This story of survivors is very important to this book. But that being said, I understand that we is a very capacious pronoun, and there are some people who will fluctuate into and out of that we.
It's so beautifully put. I love this. Well, I mean, just this hard truth that that we have to, you know, it has to be a collective movement. It has to be people together to make change. And that's so captured so well, I think, in the use of the we pronoun, and also just in the form of vision of these poems too, you know. Well, you bring up so many things, and there's so much to talk about, more to talk about. But I think this brings us to a good point to maybe have one last kind of element. And so maybe I'll pose it to you. I've got one more question I could ask, or maybe it might be nice to just hear another poem. So what do you think? What would you like to do?
Another question.
Okay, great. Absolutely. Okay, so here's my question, and it's a short one, but I'm hoping that it's challenging. And that's just basically like, what about poetry specifically do you think makes it uniquely suited to demand something like the abolition of police, to be an activist voice, to speak on behalf of community? Like, is there something specific about poetry, like more than, you know, other forms of art, other forms of writing, that make it particularly well adapted to that, for you, you know?
Yeah, so when I think about the Poetics of Abolition, I think about it in two prongs. I think the first thing is that poets are the dreamers. We don't have answers. We have a whole bunch of questions. We create worlds that aren't tied to reality. We're logical. We jump from one thought or image or sound to the next. And within the abolitionist imagination, I think that's really useful, because as poets, we can say, we don't want police, we want land back to Indigenous folks with reparations. And we could say exactly how we envision our idealized world. And then people could come to us and say, that's illogical. And as poets, we could say, I know, whoever thought a poet was logical. And I think that's really beautiful. Other people in the movement could figure out the legislative or the tactical, or how we get there step by step. But I think as poets, our role within abolitionist spaces is to name and to move towards the world outside of reality. Name what we want. That's the responsibility of our imagination. And then the second thing that I think poets do is we have an obsessive relationship to language. And I think we can name state violence where state violence otherwise goes unnamed. And what that looks like is, for example, saying human caging instead of incarceration, saying kidnapping instead of arrest. Because when I see the police extract my community members from their social and economic lives, when my community members assume that they're going home for dinner, for me, that's kidnapping. The trauma of that, to be extracted unknowingly from your communities, that's kidnapping by a stranger on the street. And I think that that's the role of the poet, is to provide the most specific word choice possible in order to make the reality of what's going on visible.
I'm so bowled over by that answer. Like, I don't know. I mean, you've just kind of said it perfectly. I'm naming what it is and naming what it could be, I mean, that sense of, and that poets are the freest to do that. That's, I don't know. I'm just really, my heart is like super warm. Just thinking about that space for poets, of course, because I love the poets, but well, Christopher, thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Again, I mean, we could go on and on and on, but we'll try and keep it consumable for our audience here. It was so great to hear the poems and just talk so much about your history and spoken word and your experiences in activism. And so just keep fighting, keep going out, keep reading the poems.
Thank you. Thanks for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you all out there for tuning in. And we'll see you in the next episode.